May I now invite on stage Ila Patnaik, Chief Economist, Aditya Birla Group, and Arjun Subramaniam, President's Chair of Excellence, National Defense College, to join the panel with Bibek Debroy, moderated by Raja.
Do we start? Yeah, okay. Thanks. I thought there was... Welcome. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for this second part of the evening today, the panel discussion on the book. First of all, I want to begin by, really noting that while Bibek and I contributed to this, bringing out this volume, much of the credit for conception, raising resources for this project, and executing it must go to Ashley, who really put in, a perseverance to actually get this through. So it's really a lot of credit goes to him. Second, I think, as Ashley said in the morning, there is also an intellectual context. I just want to say a few words before I go to the panelists about the greatness, which is the title in this book. Today, there is, unbounded optimism about India's prospects. The idea that India becomes a great power is taken for granted. But this was not the case before. So I think it's important to know how we've gotten here. I don't know how many of you know Gahur Rizvi, the South Asia scholar, Bangladeshi diplomat later. He wrote how the scholars of India in the US and much of the West were discouraged to be optimistic about India. That India was really not going to make it because of all the problems that it has. That therefore it is better to be pessimistic about India rather than optimistic about India. And this view had a strong mirror image within India itself. Many of our friends argued that, look, capitalism is in crisis, new countries can't join it, and that latecomers will not be able to make it. Therefore, it's really not possible for you to get ahead in the international system in a manner that Dr. Jaishankar was talking about. So this pessimism is surprising because India was in the top 10 economies. Today we talk about India being the fifth largest economy. But if you go back to 1950, India was in the top 10 economies. And it was there till 1970. But yet the policy framework, the assumptions of India's trajectory were fundamentally constrained by a pessimism about India's prospects, both externally as well as internally. And that had a whole lot of consequences, I think. But today, in the last 20 years, there is optimism. There is idea that, look, India can become great and that it can become a major power. It can become a leading power. And ideas that actually must say that Carnegie India was associated with it. Just Ashley, when the Carnegie India was launched in April 2016, Mr. Jaishankar was the one who launched it. And that time, the paper on, India as a leading power by Ashley Tellis was published to mark that occasion. So I think while the idea that India is rising has caught on, there's not enough work on how do we get there. What are the challenges? What are the kind of foundations we need to go there? And I think that's what this book does. And that's where the contribution of this book is not merely as, claiming a goal, but of looking at where we are today. What are the problems that we have and how do we get there? And the book is organized around four broad themes. One is the economic foundations, one on state capacity, another one on international presence, and a bit on the military and foreign policy issues. So that is the way it is organized. And my sense is it had a number of authors. We managed to get some very senior scholars as well as younger scholars. So it's a great team out here that contributed to the book. Some of them are in the audience. I can see Dr. Rakesh Mohan and Kishore Desai here, if I'm not recognizing anyone else. So it's really a fabulous book, and I would say it's not somebody was saying it's a bedtime read because you can go to sleep reading in one page, but it is something that you take your time, read, and chapter by chapter, each one offers you some insights into the Indian trajectory and where India is headed. So what we have is, we have three panelists, and I'm going to start with Ila. You can talk about the economic foundations, and then I'll go to Arjun to talk about the military issues, and finally I'll come to Bibek to talk about the larger institutional issues which a chapter deals with. Ela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raja. So, in terms of the economy, I think it is by now fairly clear that India is very fast growing. India has a lot of potential and is one of the most favored destinations in the world. So it is the fastest growing large economy in the world today. Something that we hoped for. And as Rajamon said, something that, the world was always ready to say that may not happen. Anything that went wrong, the world would step in and say, oh, now things have gone wrong. But that's where we are today. And yet it is something that we have to work very hard to keep that advantage with us. So, when we look at why is it such an attractive investment destination, is because we are the largest market. Everybody wants a foot in, whether it's from the demand side or the supply side. The demographics are something that is going to be there. So these are young people who have entered a certain age, and for the next 2 decades, the world understands that this is going to be one of the largest markets in the world. The world also understands that this is going to be the place where there is diversity of skills, of resources. And so even from the supply side, this is a place where you want to be. So you want to produce here, you want to cater to the demand that India offers. So not just is India a destination like what East Asia might have been, where those could be countries where you produce and export to the rest of the world. But at least from the point of view both of domestic investors and foreign investors, the fact that India is a very large market is one of the biggest drivers of investment today. Now, we can't take it for granted. And I think that's what the book is also about. And as Ashley said, that's one of the things that we want to keep being aware of, and that policymakers have to be nimble. They have to be constantly not just thinking of what is the long-term, what are the long-term reforms that we need to do, but also that all the time we are facing new challenges. There are short-term crises, not just in foreign policy, but also on the economic front. There are short-term challenges that keep arising, whether it's energy prices, whether it is the carbon, which is, again, a long-term, as well as short-term pressures arise, decarbonizing. But with these challenges, we and policymakers have to constantly be nimble, respond, so that we don't lose the advantage that we have. So while we do have an advantage, but there are many, many factors that could easily, I don't want to join the band of pessimists and say that we can't do the things that will allow us to keep these as opportunities, and that will allow us to become great, but we do constantly have to keep working at it. Thanks.
Thanks for that succinct presentation. Arjun, the floor is yours, and you can talk about the defense and security challenges there.
Thank you, Raja, and good evening, everyone. At the outset, I'm delighted to be part of this wonderfully curated anthology, and I'd like to thank Ashley for the opportunity to be part of it. And taking off from where the External Affairs Minister left off, and when he spoke about the kind of environment that we actually live in, which predicates the necessity to build strong military capability. And I think none of us should have any illusions about the kind of securitized regional and international security environment that exists today. And that is the fundamental proposition that I begin with when I put together my framework for pushing boundaries, can the Indian military transform, as one of the key ingredients of India as a leading power in the years ahead. So there are three fundamental issues that I think are going to drive this desire and ability to transform. One is capability development. The second, is transformation and restructuring. And the third is being able to keep pace with the technology environment. And why this is going to be very, very important is because if you see the kind of asymmetry that is building up vis-a-vis India's principal adversary, military adversary, which is China, I think unless we engage in some serious leapfrogging, the asymmetry will sort of widen excessively. And that is the reason why capability development, I think, occupies pole position in the list of doable propositions that I offer in the chapter. And here again about doability, I think the very fact that I've been in uniform for 36, 37 years and thereafter made this transition into academia and writing, I think much of what I argue in my chapter is not in the realm of the undoable. They're all doable propositions, and the way in which I argue my case in the chapter is to examine how elements of a transformed Indian military could further Indian strategic objectives in a space that is restricted not only to the Indo-Pacific. And there again, if you connect the dots with what the External Affairs Minister mentioned, that with Indian influence growing rapidly, development of military capability to be exercised not just within geographical frontiers, but within a larger space, whether it is protection of interests or whether it is expansion of legitimate influence. I think development of military capability is going to form a very, very important part of this Indian rise. Now, another thing which has engaged me over the last decade are issues of proactive deterrence and some amount of coercion as part of our strategic lexicon, right? I've always believed that much of the flavor of deterrence that India has exercised over the last 75 years has been restrained, yes, but also at times restrictive and diffident. And I think over the last decade or so, we've seen this propensity to move ahead to a more proactive flavor of deterrence, embedded with some amount of coercive capability. And I think this is extremely important when one looks at our willingness to convert these ideas into concepts. However, let's be honest that there is a huge gap to bridge between intent and the capability to execute such strategies, particularly against more powerful and at times more nimble adversaries. So my section on the Indian Army, in fact, when you look at the Indian Army very briefly, I think there are 3 or 4 things that can very easily be achieved over the next couple of years. One is enhancement of firepower, because firepower allows you to cause attrition, and I think attrition is going to be fundamental to any short, high-intensity conflict that India may have to engage in the years ahead. Battlefield surveillance, rebalancing and reconfiguring offensive formations, and building better special forces capability would actually be at the heart of this transformation. But interestingly, the challenge for the Indian Army, I argue, is that a continued continental focus leaves little room for any radical downsizing, and that actually right-sizing may be the only option for the Indian Army over the next decade or so. My own sense about the Indian Navy in the years ahead is that notwithstanding its expansive maritime doctrine that positions it as a key instrument of military diplomacy and a preferred security partner in the region, actually accretion of warfighting capability and sea power discourse must not suffer. The Indian Navy is and must continue to be a warfighting navy. As far as the Indian Air Force is concerned, my chapter reflects on how best to manage depleting offensive assets by reorienting roles and missions to cater to the no war, no peace paradigm and limited coercion, something that actually the Indian Air Force has been quite comfortable with in the last couple of years, given the Balakot experience, albeit with a few minor hiccups, and of course the very swift mobilization in eastern Ladakh. So now, I'm sure many of you would sort of be curious to understand about jointness. Jointness and integration is the flavor of the season. And the way I look at it is jointness is in the mind, and integration is what happens on the ground. And that interface between jointness and integration is actually the entire joint planning process. And I think when it comes to the transformation of India's armed forces, rather than straight away diving headlong into the entire theaterization process, which is a work in progress, I think this whole concept of fusing jointness and integration is the way forward. Now, among the several issues related to the Indo-Pacific, I highlight three central themes. First is the importance of militarily and geographically understanding what the Indo-Pacific means for India in terms of what it can bring to the table and what may be a bridge too far. Second is the urgent need for developing island springboards for military operations, such as the Andaman-Nicobar complex of islands and the Laccadives and Lakshadweep. The third and final proposition as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned is to build on the tremendous interoperability that has been built over the years amongst the Quad members. And I argue that this interoperability is not enough. One must move forward to a concept that I call interchangeability, which means being able to operate with comfort with each other's resources and take the foundational agreements like the LEMOA and the COMCASA to the next level. Now, I think without much any further ado, that's it, what the chapter looks at. And I'm sure it is in the realm of doable propositions that I offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun. Vivek, you had a chapter on the institutional transformation of the government of India.
Thank you, Raja, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You've probably briefly been able to see the cover of the book. In the list of editors, it says Ashley Tellis first, my name is second, and we have Raja Mohan as the third. That's exactly the way it is in the book. Ashley has written the introduction. Raja has written the epilogue. So, Raja, you should not have spoken so early. And I'm somewhere in the middle. As Ashley and Raja both mentioned, the seeds of this book are rooted in Ashley's 2016 essay. As Raja also said, and I cannot disagree with him, that Ashley did most of the work. We got our names in there, including the title. I don't think Grasping Greatness was a title we suggested, we endorsed it. But for me, the roots of the book go back even further. The precursor to this book was another book also published by Penguin, released, if I remember, either on the 9th or 10th of June 2014. The title of that book, again decided by Ashley and endorsed by us, the editors, was Getting India Back on Track. So in June 2014, we were thinking about getting India back on track. Now, 8 years down the line, we've accepted that India is back on track, and we are now talking about a rising power and grasping greatness. There is a motley collection of essays in this book, as has already been described. And it's a thick book. It has 651 pages. I had not realized it was going to be this huge. Motley collection of essays. In some ways, you could say all the essays are about reforms of one kind or the other. Except reform should not be defined narrowly in terms of the economic reforms lens. There are a bunch of papers, of which ELA's is one. On the economic side, Rakesh, who's here, has another one. If you look at whatever are the consensus growth forecasts, I'm not talking about the Economic Advisory Council's forecasts, but the consensus growth forecasts about real growth in India over the next few years, you will get a figure of something like 6.5% of thereabouts. I'm not talking about this year, which is why I think the book has 651 pages, 6.51% to be precise. So the essays are essentially about jacking up that growth trajectory from whatever it is, 6.5% to higher. In the economic parts of the book, as you'd expect, there is a macro essay by Rakesh, who's seated here, and there are essays on what you need to do to step up savings and capital formation, that's ELA, to enhance labor productivity, that's Surjit Bhalla and one of his colleagues, and what you need to do to get an extra engine of growth from integrating with the global economy. So it's an expected bunch of essays, expected themes, except, of course, what enriches the book is the scholarship and analysis these authors bring to the book. Economic reforms, however you define them, are embedded in a notion of a market, and that notion of a market is embedded in a certain society's history, legal background, context, the constitution. Quite often economists, and I am an economist, do not pay sufficient attention to the institutions. The paper that I have written with Kishore Desai, my co-author who's also here, is on a limited part of that. Because if we are talking about rising power, and if we are talking about reforms, we need to talk about the constitution. We need to talk about the functioning of the judiciary. We need to talk about the functioning of the executive. We need to talk about the functioning of the legislature, not only at the union government level, but also at the state government levels. Our limited essay is on what one needs to do to improve efficiency and state capacity at the level of the union government executive. This book, which Ashley did not say, since that earlier book was published in 2014, this book was planned for 2019. It got delayed because of COVID and the pandemic. I'm sure, although he has not told us yet, Ashley is planning another book for 2024. In the 2024 book, whatever be the title, I'm certain there will be greater focus on some of these other institutions that we have not been able to handle in this book, state level, judiciary, legislature, so on and so forth. Thanks, Raja.
Thanks, Vivek. I think I just wanted to add the foreign policy section. I mean, I think in a way, I have a long chapter at the end looking at how India's engagement with the world is changing and how India can change the terms of current engagement to raise itself up to a higher level of the kind that Minister Jaishankar was talking about. But in a deeper way, the foreign policy runs through the whole text. I mean, it is about India's relationship with the world in a sense, whether the nature of India's economic integration, the nature of India's defense relationship with the rest of the world, and the nature of, I mean, there are two separate chapters by Rohan Mukherjee, Rajesh Rajagopal and others who look at state capacity to raise India's international effectiveness. So the book covers a lot of the foreign policy, not in a traditional diplomatic sense, but I think there is a chapter on which is my chapter, but the rest of the book too brings together a whole set of factors that are fundamentally altering the nature of India's engagement with the world. Because without 91 and the reforms that took place then, we wouldn't be talking about India's greatness. We would still be in the pessimistic phase that so deeply permeated Indian thinking. And as I said, in 2000s, as India's high growth rates began, things changed. when we started talking about great power, India as a great power, I mean, I think the credit goes to APJ Abdul Kalam, who was a president, after he retired as president, wrote a book, India is a Developed Country. That was really a first attempt by a public person to say, look, we can be a developed country. For a country that had defined itself as developing, third world, for so many decades, you have suddenly, who's not a IR scholar, but it is an aspiration, a goal that is set for India. India can be a developed nation. But yet, if you see as late as 2008, there were leading political figures in India saying, no, we don't want to be a great power. We don't like it. We want to be a soft power. We don't want to be a great power. That's not India we know. In India, that does not seek greatness, but it is something else that we are satisfied with our status. So there was a lot of resistance to the notion that India can aspire to be a great power. I mean, it came from highest political levels, from a leading political party. And what has changed, I think, in the last few years, without getting too much into domestic politics, the nature of the aspiration of India has fundamentally changed. So when Ashley wrote the paper in 2016, that was about an aspirational, how do we get there in an abstract sense. But I think the book actually fleshes out a whole lot of assessments on where we are and how do we make the transition. And hopefully your next book will tell us what level of changes that we need. So I thought I'll just ask one question each before we go to the audience. Ila, I mean, I think, which Vivek talked about the reforms idea runs through the book, but the kind of reforms the international agencies and most Western say, these are the X, Y, Z you have to do, 20 reforms, but what India did was somewhat quite counterintuitive, whether it is on trade-related issues, whether it's on manufacturing, whether it is on the way you organized yourself, and certainly in the last 4 years, certainly after the pandemic, the nature of the reforms was very different from what was listed as the standard set of guidelines for India.
So I think what India did was to put herself on a path of formalization of the economy. And that was not something that had come to us from all the advisors that we had. And putting ourselves on this path of formalization meant reforms such as GST, because that kind of pulls people into the formal sector, into the tax-paying sector. Digitization, which we know has today, many of us don't carry cash in our wallets. There's a social security net which is based on the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile, the kind of direct benefit transfers that long ago we used to hear about from Latin America, and the World Bank would tell us about them. But what we did here and the scale at which we created a digital infrastructure for doing direct benefit transfers was something completely unheard of and not imagined by anybody else. So the kind of reforms we did through all of this, through the digitization, through GST, through various other reforms such as the Indian Bankruptcy Code, which actually allowed the system to get out of its old problem of public sector banks giving money to a few cronies who would then basically run away with the money by creating a system where they had to lose their money. So what we did was actually a very different path. We charted our own course, and in this journey, I'm not sure that all those advisors have even understood how fast we have moved and how effectively we have moved.
Now it gets a lot of praise, of course, all the digitization.
Yeah, after it's all done. But when it was being done, there was this sense of they don't know what they're doing. There was a sort of, I would say, looking down upon, this is not a clear strategy, because the strategy had not come from there.
Vivek, you want to add something on this reform agenda in terms of how it has played out in the last 4-5 years?
Well, I'd react to it like this, that any reforms, any template of reforms must fundamentally be endogenous and must be devised within the country. Unfortunately, in that template of reforms that was projected from the outside, reforms were equated only with one item, which was privatization. If privatization happened, there was reforms. If privatization did not happen, there were no reforms. That entire paradigm is now under some question marks, partly because of COVID, partly because of what had happened before COVID. And I think everyone now acknowledges that it was many of these other reforms that India did, and Ila mentioned some of these, the provision of basic necessities. It was because of these, because of restraint, because of being fiscally somewhat reluctant to splurge on revenue expenditure and instead focus on capital expenditure, that we have not got into the kind of mess that some other countries have got into. So in a sense, the moral in all this is it is best to disregard any suggestions that are imported and implanted, especially if they reflect an imperfect understanding of what is going on within the economy.
Thanks. Maybe I'll go to Arjun. I mean, I think you heard the minister rule out an expeditionary type of role for the Indian Armed Forces of the kind that the US does, or we've done in Sri Lanka. But he's also presided over or actually expanding what we call military diplomacy, that of actually working with other partners, like the Navy does a lot, in partnership. I think Army is somewhat slower, but they're also doing things, and the Air Force does stuff. This notion that we need to work with others for our security, and that there's room for that, was alien to Indian defense policy well into the 90s. I mean, we starting with the Malabar exercises, we started in 92. Till then, we're alone, just as the complement to non-alignment and self-reliance was military isolationism. But has the military establishment, has the defense ministry, have actually gotten out of the sense of the look, we're a lone ranger, we're going to work on our own, though we do Quad, we do Malabar, we do a lot of things. Is there a readiness, say, that we can work with others and benefit from it, as well as expand our footprint, military footprint, our impact on the world through coalitions? Because the original premise of non-alignment was you don't do military cooperation with anyone, but we are doing it now. So that's a huge departure. But is that internalized in a
So, Raja, fundamentally, I have a contrarian view on the Indian military's ability and willingness to engage with foreign militaries, right? There are two silos here. Since the 1960s and the 1970s, the Indian military has been flexible and adaptable enough to absorb Western strategies, tactics, operational art, and fuse it with its own capacities and capabilities to come up with a very credible, with very credible military responses. So the Indian military has always been open and flexible to ideas from abroad, from the West, from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from France, from Israel. It was a stated government policy in the past, to sort of ensure that an insulated, till the Indo-US strategic partnership actually took off. Now, I think the audience would be interested in knowing that the United States engages with the Indian military more than what it engages with its traditional allies in terms of military exercises. The military exercises have grown in strength, they've grown in scope, and I think the kind of interoperability and the kind of understanding that one has of what they call TTPs is exceptional. So I think the Indian military, and right now even the Ministry of Defense, is very, very open to partnerships in the military domain. And it's not that the Indian military footprint hasn't been visible globally in the past. The Indian flag on United Nations peacekeeping and peace enforcement missions have been extremely impactful, right? Yes, expeditionary, the word expeditionary is a no-no in the Indian military lexicon, but we're very comfortable with the terminology of out-of-area contingency operations. There is a willingness to think about engaging the military or using the Indian military to protect overseas interests. So I think, I think it would be fair to say that the Indian military, and we are at an inflection point wherein there is the willingness and the capacity to engage globally.
Thank you. I think we're beginning to see that not only in the exercises, but in military production. For the first time, we had the Tatas and the Airbus agreed to produce a C-295 military transport aircraft, which is really the first private sector aircraft production in India. Hopefully, it's just the beginning of expansion of India's defense production infrastructure as opposed to merely buying from others. But I think we got about barely 10 minutes, so maybe I'll take 3 questions from the floor. Those of you who want to ask sharp, short questions, we'll take all the 3 at a time. So is there someone there? Yeah. Yes, sir. Can you just introduce yourself and be brief?
Yes, my name is Subhash. I am from the energy sector. My question is to Mr. Bibek. Recently, the environmental meeting at the Egypt has thrown a big challenge to India on the thermal power stations. The coal, we have to reduce the dependency on the coal. So in India, it is a huge infrastructure in the thermal power sector, as well as the associated.
So make it brief. I mean, we are really
brief. So, and the mining industry. So my question is, in the next 10 years, what will be the status of the thermal power in India?
Thank you. We'll take the 2 more questions.
And
Yes,
one more to Arjun.
No, please. Look,
Okay,
there are 2 more.
you.
I think we need to close this. Yeah. Yes, but please be brief.
Yeah, sure. So, thank you for the great session. I am a second-year student of political science from Delhi University. My name's Arman. My question is basically about the broader world order which we see India placed in. The sort of crisis which we see in the world order seem to be a result of internal legitimation crises within these sort of revisionist powers, and they themselves don't seem to have an idea of what sort of compelling world order they want to establish. My question really is that this sort of seems to be a world where we're muddling from crisis to crisis, and it seems to be sort of a sort of motion without movement. My question is that if we as India, as a rising power, want to establish some sort of movement, not only motion.
Get out of the caveat. Give us the question.
If we want to establish some sort of movement, what exactly is our ultimate objective here? And how much are we willing to compromise for it? And how dynamic is that ultimate objective?
Thank you. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Sweetie Kumari. I'm second-year student. I'm a philosophy student. So, as we heard that all the essays talk about reformation. So, is there any essay is dealing with ethical dilemma that come up with technological advancement?
Okay. You want to start with your Arjun, then we'll come this way. And
So I have, for the second question, I have a very short answer. That look, after a fairly long period of globalization and this proposition that the world is flat and the end of history and stuff like that, I think we are now back at a time when fear, honor, and interest seem to be dominating the public discourse in the world all around us. And that is why, if you recollect, I mentioned that unfortunately we are going through a period wherein I see a highly securitized global environment that is actually pushing back against a global desire for economic development. And our own long-term perspective is towards what the Prime Minister calls Amrit Kal and India transiting to a fully developed economy by the time it turns 100. So I think as far as India is concerned, it will have to play a very, very delicate balancing act between coping with this highly securitized regional and global environment and its long-term objectives of unbridled economic growth leading to a fully developed status. So it will be a tough act to sort of build on.
Ira, if you want to answer any. Yeah. But you can also give final thoughts.
Yeah, Ila always prefers to for final thoughts. Before reacting to the questions, some of us will recollect the Goldman Sachs dreaming with the bricks. What was the real growth rate projected for India in that? 5.5%. Today, if the real growth rate in India is 5.5%, in terms of its aspirations, gloom and doom will descend. It is more or less the consensus, as I said earlier, that India will do 6.5% or thereabouts in the medium term. Ashley's introductory chapter has a very interesting table. And that table has projections made by various people of what India's GDP is going to be in dollars in the year 2050. Not the per capita one, the aggregate. The range collated by Ashley is from 7 trillion to 41 trillion. In a different context, Dr. Jaishankar said that many things that happened he did not expect. Exactly similarly, anyone who projects is bound to be wrong. But the point is, what these essays stress is if you do A, B, C, D, you will be closer to 41 trillion. I don't think we'll be anywhere, we'll be much beyond 7 trillion, so forget that. You'll be closer to 41 trillion than to 25 trillion in 2047. This is what the book is about. Does the book talk about values? No, we'll bear in mind that for a future book. Crisis. India has not been responsible for any of the recent crises. All the recent crises that emerging market economies have faced have emanated from elsewhere. I doubt very much, even if it becomes a great power, India will ever trigger a crisis. Question about thermal energy, very interesting one, but question should be restricted to what the book talks about. So I quickly checked what Rakesh's essay was on. I thought I knew what it was on, but I checked it. It does not talk about thermal energy. You have a perfectly valid question. Look at the wonderful papers that are published by Rakesh's center. They will answer your question.
Thanks. There was one question on order. I think we are closed with the questions. There was a question on order which you raised. Look, idea that there's an end state in the international system, I think is fundamentally mistaken. If you look at last 100 years, every 20 years there was serious structural changes, constant churning, constant shift in the distribution of power among major powers. If you look at last 100 years, many empires collapsed. You saw the rise of new nations and the 2 world wars that came in. Yet the so-called order that was established in 1945 collapsed within 4 years, once the military conflict started. So when we talk about the liberal order that came in after 45, that was really within the Western world. Soviet Union opted out. A lot of developing countries resistant, not fully part of it. So this notion that there is a single order, that we're going to get there, for us, recognize the nature of change that is unfolding in the international system, which is constant, as India's own rise points out. As I said, if you go back to a book called Asian Drama in the 1960s, it was said, look, Asia had no future. Asia was dead. It's just going to be triage in the great European competition. But yet you saw today, the rest of Asia rose, finally India is also rising. Therefore, this notion that it will be a static system, we're not in a static system. So far, the only static element has been the share of American economic GDP in the global world. But the rest of it is constantly churning. So for us, how do we get to a position where we can generate more prosperity, well-being to our own people, and at the same time shape the international system in a way that satisfies the largest number of people? It's not easy, as the minister said, we still don't have the capacity, but it is through coalitions and other partnerships that we begin to influence the international system to the extent that we can, because you need to influence the rules. As your size grows, of your population, of your economy, you need to rework the rules in a way that benefits you and the larger international system. And I think it's a continuous effort. And there is no clear end point that you can just go there. Look, we said globalization was irreversible. That was just 30 years ago. Tom Friedman was writing Flat World. I mean, we're in a more complicated world. People said, look, America, Russia, China will always get together. They don't. So I think it is to be able to see the shifting currents and responding to it is the challenge, and not political science. Of course, their job is to keep inferring potential things, but that is a heuristic device. That's not the real world. Real world is where policymakers have to deal with continuous change, and I think that is the challenge for states and statesmanship. Maybe I'll stop here, and I think I want to thank all the three panelists, and please join me in giving a big hand to our three panelists here.